I'm Henry Bonsu and this is Doubling Down, where every week we discuss an issue that's got you fired up on social media and beyond. Joining me today are David Collins, Professor of International Economic Law at London City University, and the journalist and business consultant Tete Cofield. Welcome to both of you. Thank you very much for being here. Now, for months it was a case of shadow boxing, but now the gloves are off. The trade war is finally here. And while initial US tariffs on China amount to $34 billion, a second round will total $16 billion. The goods on the list will include boats, aircraft engines, semiconductors, and a long list of other industrial and agricultural machines. China has also imposed reciprocal tariffs on US imports, including soybeans, cotton, corn, tobacco, and cars. Now, if this were only a dispute between the world's two largest economies, that would be bad enough, but it isn't. The US has also imposed separate tariffs of 25% on imports of steel and aluminium from the EU, Canada, and Mexico. Canada has retaliated, and so has Mexico. The EU has responded to American steel tariffs with $3.4 billion of their own against US whiskey, jeans, and motorbikes. Trump has said trade wars are good and easy to win. But many analysts are warning of dire consequences if this gets out of hand. Okay, panel, let's get into this. I'm going to start off with you, David. When all this started, many commentators said it was all about posturing, hence shadow boxing. But now it's getting serious. Is this a trade war?
Well, this is a question of semantics, and I guess the question is, when does the battle become the war? How long is a piece of string? Yep. It's pretty bad to see tariffs of this level against so many countries. What makes me nervous about the particular situation that we're in now is you've got the two largest economies in the world with tariffs well into the billions of dollars. But probably worse than that is the fact that the US is imposing these trade barriers on its allies.
Yes.
So Canada, the EU, places like Mexico and so on. So these are countries where there's been historic military alliance, and now we're being told that that these tariffs have been levied for a national security purpose. It's very hard to believe, and if we are to believe it, then it means that there's a broader sort of geopolitical motivation behind this, and that's the kind of thing that makes me nervous.
Well, Donald Trump says he's fulfilling campaign promises, and America has, and I quote him, been raped by China, being treated very unfairly by the EU. Everybody's profiting on the back of America. It's a now America first. Does he have a point in any of that?
I think he has a point on a number of fronts. With respect to China, the problem with China has been that they've led to a massive overcapacity in steel, amongst other things, part of which is due to state support and the fact that world trade laws have not really been able to deal with things like dumping, which is really what China has done. So the anti-dumping laws under the World Trade Organization are currently kind of weak. And of course, his other complaint with respect to China is that China has been forcing US companies to engage in technology transfer as a condition to invest in China. Also not fair, also not covered under World Trade Organization rules.
But couldn't the US do the same? You know, nobody's forcing the US to buy Chinese steel. Nobody's, the US it could easily impose similar restrictions on Chinese companies wanting to come into their markets.
Well, in fact, they are doing that, but this is when you go down the path of vigilantism, down the path of protectionism. There is overcapacity in the world steel market. It's largely because of China, and the mechanisms that we have to deal with that, and what I'm talking about there is the World Trade Organization, aren't really fit for purpose. Now, part of that is the US's fault for blocking the appointment of judges to the appellate body of the World Trade Organization, which I can get in if you want me to. So there is definitely an issue there. With respect to the EU, yes, there are higher tariffs on things like automobiles, about 10% than what the US imposes on EU automobiles. So he has a point there. I don't see it with Canada. So I think a lot of this is posturing, it's fulfilling election promises, and I'm assuming that his base in the industrial heartland of the US probably gets a perverse pleasure out of this, but it will hurt them.
Yeah.
It won't work.
Well, we're going to talk to a member of his base very shortly on this program. Tete, you want to kind of add
But what I find interesting is that he's given a long form answer to this thing. Yeah. Yes, we are in a trade war because these tariffs and so on are the artillery which derive from the mindset of protectionism.
Yes.
Once that mindset is in place, you have already declared war by another means, and the consequences are felt.
Well, you say protectionism is a form of war when it comes to trade, but President Trump seems to be saying it's a form of defense.
Again,
not attack.
This is a question of, this is the most important thing is that the situation as it actually presents itself. Now, you have America, a country which has agriculture as its third largest export. 43% of its agricultural produce is bought by people who, as David says, were former allies. What do you call this? But, you know, as far as I'm concerned, anything by war. But crucially, businessmen aren't politicians. Businessmen
Well, they are
act
now.
their actions have huge political consequences. Yes. But businessmen act on sentiments. So the moment they get the whiff that this is the way the wind is blowing, they start making decisions. And that's why the IMF, I think this Monday, said that if these things continue, it's going to cost the world $430 billion worth of trade and therefore growth.
All right, David, I know you're itching to get back in, and you mentioned Donald Trump's base, and some of them may get a perverse pleasure out of this, but maybe they should watch out. Let's develop that thought because, okay, we know what our panel thinks. What about those who are on the front line in this dispute and whose very livelihoods are at stake? People like Bill Gordon, who farms soybeans in Minnesota, America's rural Midwest, and he joins us via Skype from there now. Bill, thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Now, you're a director of the American Soybean Association. 60% of your exports go to China. It's just imposed a tariff of 25% on your product. What's your reaction?
What's disappointing for the fact that we spent billions of dollars of farmer money developing this market since the 1980s. And we go over in other countries too, like the gentleman was saying, our allies are our greatest asset when it comes to exports. We can't consume all of that in the United States. So when you have the disappointing action of a tariff and jack it up 25% compared to our competitors around the world, it hits an impact at home. We've had a 20%, at least closer to 25% retraction in price here in America.
25%, did you say? I mean, so in monetary terms, on your own business, what impact? I mean, how much money are you losing?
Right now, if we would sell all of our soybeans in the fall, which there's some marketing done prior, we'd stand to lose about $100,000 in our bottom line right now, just on our farm alone.
So what are you hearing from your members? What feedback? What do they want President Trump to do? Do they want him to change course?
Yeah, and I think the tariffs part is we understand the gentleman we're talking about. We understand the policy of defense and trying to fix the problem of maybe overcapacity, the dumping, but is tariffs really the way to go about it when you have good free trade agreements and you work it out make each party more responsible for what they do? We feel, especially in agriculture, that we provide the world a great product and we shouldn't be held hostage because of another product, and vice versa. We don't want to be used as a pawn to offset steel or anything else.
Let's see what our panelists have to say to you. We've got David and Tete here. They've been listening intently. Gentlemen, what would you want to, David, Tete, what do you want to say, David?
Well,
yes.
Well, see, it seems to me that there is nothing President Trump can do to affect his support in his core areas, which I believe you come from. But this is going to hurt you to the tune of six figures. Is support for the president's policies still holding up?
Over to you, David. What do you think? Are you still supporting the president through thick and thin? Or do you feel that actually, if your losses increase, things are going to change? You're going to want somebody else to be running the show?
That's always a tough decision and a tough question, right? So we in America support our president like everybody supports their chair or president of their country. It's this policy of the tariffs and the trade war that the Midwest and the country right now is definitely not supportive. You have groups that are. Agriculture right now is not supportive of the policy. It doesn't mean we're not supportive of the president. There's the kind of a fine line I understand, but this is not a good trade war for American agriculture.
And you've just come back from a trip to see clients in Europe. How worried are you by what you heard and saw? In fact, what kind of reception did you get?
Well, the reception was friendly, but of course they're saying the same thing. We have all these, we're allies, and now we're opposing tariffs back and forth on each other for national security. And their question to me was the same thing as the gentleman we're talking about earlier, why? And I, as a U.S. voter and a U.S. citizen, I don't understand all the reasons behind the administration's why, but I understand the point of the conversation. We think in agriculture there's better ways to do this than to have strict.
All right, David Collins, what do you want to say?
Yeah, well, I agree with your speaker, with Bill, entirely. There are better ways to deal with this, and the way to deal with it is through the World Trade Organization. This is why we have this global trading community, 164 countries. The U.S. is a member, China is a member. You need to take these disputes through the World Trade Organization system, bring a complaint to the WTO courts, and if that works properly, which it should, if they're properly staffed, then we know, is it right or is it wrong? Is it illegal? Is the dumping illegal? Is there subsidies going on? If there is, then the U.S., as it were, is authorized to retaliate, and that's, to me, not a trade war. This is the system working properly. But instead we see vigilantism. We see the U.S. imposing these tariffs on its own, and that's when the system begins to break down. And the other interesting point that Bill made was about having a free trade agreement between the U.S. and China. This would be fantastic, because if you have a free trade agreement, which we don't have a bilateral agreement between the U.S. and China, an agreement like this could also deal with investment, which is this problem again with the forced technology transfer, and it could de-escalate, depoliticize all of these problems, these disputes, and we would have legal solutions, and it wouldn't lead to the point that people like Bill are having their business tarnished through these unnecessary tariffs.
Bill, what are your thoughts on that? Because the President of the United States does not believe in the World Trade Organization. Do you?
Yes, as agriculture, we just had a anti-dumping case with Argentina and Indonesia biodiesel. They're bringing it in the United States, taking $1 tax credit and moving it over to the European market. 700 million gallons of biodiesel, of our U.S. biodiesel now, has created the market, and with the anti-dumping tariffs in place, which, like the gentleman said, are WTO enforced, now there's no retaliation from Argentina or Indonesia. They're working around with appeals, of course, but it's a win for agriculture when you go through the right channels. Okay,
Bill, and finally, what do you hope will happen next?
Communication, and that's what we've been asking for the whole time in agriculture. And I think in America, let's communicate with our allies, and let's sit down and make good trade agreements. We pulled out of TPP. Agriculture was definitely against that. We have great trade partners, the Japanese, that Southeast Asia market, Australia. We're all one giant world of agriculture products, and some of us raise things better than others. We need products from China. Let's work it out. Let's get free trade agreements in place and move forward and remove these tariffs and go about it the correct way.
All right, Bill Gordon, Director of the American Soybean Association, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let's get some reaction from the panel to what Bill said there. And Teddy, you wanted to put something in.
Well, it's very interesting that he's focusing so much on the importance of the dialogue.
Yep.
Because I was going to ask him if he would now be asking the president if his soybean association would be asking for something of a rescue package if the impact of these new tariffs is so large on his business. The president can't watch huge swathes of America suffer this way. Will America step up and rescue them?
Well, at the moment, there's no sign of that, is there?
Well, in the case of the steel tariffs, there's been something like 20,000 petitions that have been brought by U.S. companies to the U.S. Trade Department asking for relief from the tariffs that have been imposed. And that was way beyond what the U.S. government expected. So industry is beginning to make their voices heard and to fight back and say that we don't want this.
When it comes to protectionism, I mean, don't all countries or regional blocs engage in a degree of that? Partly that's their raison d'etre, isn't it? You know, you get together, you've got a common interest, common travel area, common trade area. Other people or other regions aren't quite the same as you, they're much further away. You want to protect your industries and grow your market within a zone.
Well, yes, I mean, that's in a sense that is exactly how free trade areas and customs unions work. You give preferential treatment to the members of that group vis-a-vis the members that are outside of that group. So in that sense, it is protectionist, but it's allowed under WTO law because you get greater integration in those smaller units. And that's seen, economists tell us that that's what works out. But so that the trick then is to expand these units to get bigger and bigger, and that would have been the beauty of the Trans-Pacific Partnership that your guest mentioned. But unfortunately, the President Trump didn't want to pursue that, and that's now a smaller agreement. But it does exist, and I'm hopeful that perhaps the U.S. will join on to the TPP in the future.
Okay.
But it's interesting that trade wars have actually been happening, for example, between the EU and Africa for a very, very long time.
You'd call that a trade war?
Well, if the net effect, again, it's as David was talking about semantics, the net effect of these things, if they are deleterious, then you can call them the results of conflict. Of 7,000 anti-trade measures that have been promulgated in the world since 2009, half of them were laid out by the EC against Africa, affecting African agriculture. Now, because most of the population of the continent is rural, when you hurt agriculture, it's like hitting the central nerve of the entire continent. And so actually what you pay back to Africa in terms of aid and so on is total peanuts by comparison to having ripped out the guts of the continent's economy by effectively crushing their agriculture.
Well,
through
very
things
shortly,
like
we'll be talking
the CAB.
about a trade dispute between one African country and the United States. But final word on Bill there. Do you think it was a case of buyer beware? I mean, he voted for Trump. A lot of his soybean farmer colleagues voted for Trump. The tariffs are hitting his area of Minnesota and the Midwest. Do you have any sympathy for him and his colleagues?
Well, I mean, I looked at some market research polls just before this program. Trump is down 21% in Kentucky, 21% in Montana, and 25% in Oklahoma. These are core Trump supporting areas. So for sure, caveat emptor, talk is cheap.
Yes.
Backing it up with actions has real consequences. And you can't help but feel for this businessman who has invested so much time and effort in his industry just to lose six figures in the space of a few months. That's extraordinary.
Thank you very much. I'll come back to you shortly, Dave. But as you might expect, this is one of those topics that really gets people fired up. So let's see what's out there on social media. And we'll start off with Twitter. First of all, this from Avid, who says, imagine your president telling you, a farmer who voted for him, to be a patriot in the trade war against China, to hold on tight and take a loss for your country. But you know his own daughter's business won't be hurt by tariffs. Let's take a look at Facebook, and this from Daryl, who says, tariffs have historically proven toxic and destructive to economies. The last time tariffs were enforced, it caused the Great Depression. And finally, this from Ashveen, who says, as the global trade war escalates, all I can think of is the poorly thought out decision of America in choosing its opponent. Trust me, someone is going to go down, and it ain't China. Wow. And remember, you can always get involved in the conversation on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram by using the handle DOUBLINGDOWNTV. David, I know you were desperate to get back in there. Go on.
Well, I was just going to say, I think one of the things we need to look at here is the long-term effects of this. In the short term, we're seeing these horrible tariffs and this protectionism, which is causing economic strife in the US and elsewhere. But if you look at the long game, I can't help but think maybe President Trump is onto something here. He's taking action very aggressively in a way that other world leaders have not and US presidents have not. Suddenly China is now aware that its practices are not making the world happy. And maybe this is a way to effect change.
So maybe creative disruption,
yes,
which is what Trump's constantly going
way
about.
Of looking at
All right,
yes.
Let's move on, because earlier I said that every country engages in a degree of protectionism, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, to look after their own interests. Developing nations trying to build up their own industries are watching what is happening with alarm. The East African state of Rwanda is currently embroiled in its own trade war with the United States because it has hiked tariffs on imported second-hand clothing from 20 cents to $2.50 per kilo. The US has retaliated by suspending Rwanda from the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which allows certain African exporters duty-free access to the US. Linda Calabresi is a research fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, and she's been studying the situation there closely. She joins us via Skype from London. Linda, what exactly is at stake here then in this particular case?
What is at stake here? Hello, good evening. What is at stake here is the access of Rwanda to the African Growth and Opportunity Act. So access for Rwanda to the US market. Not for all products at the moment, but just the textile and garment sector specifically. But this is definitely a sector that Rwanda and other East African countries are trying to develop.
Now, quite a number of other African countries have thought of doing this to protect their own domestic markets from dumping from the US or China or elsewhere. Is it helping? Is it helping its own manufacturers?
I would say it's not, meaning this is not the measure that you need to apply if you want to develop your own textile and garment sector. Because what this does is basically it protects the producers that already exist, or it invites other producers to operate in a sheltered environment. But it doesn't allow you to develop an industry that's competitive at the international level and that can then, export to other countries as well, which is very important for a country like Rwanda, which has 12 million people, so a very small domestic market.
Now, Rwanda is part of the East African community, and so it's supposed to act in concert with several other countries like Tanzania and Kenya. Did it do so, or did it go it alone in imposing these tariffs on the second-hand clothes from the US?
Initially, it was an East African community decision. So in 2016, all countries applied this increase in tariff, although countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania increased their tariff from 20 cents to 40 cents per kilogram, whereas Rwanda went from 20 cents to $2.5 per kilogram of used clothing. So Rwanda went a lot faster than the others. And the idea was to increase it gradually, but the other countries have withdrawn. So Uganda, Tanzania, and Kenya are now not applying the measure anymore.
Okay, but if Rwanda's action isn't working, it's not helping its domestic producers, can't they grow their markets with, say, China if they've been shut out of US or even EU markets, as Tete pointed out earlier?
Yes, of course. I mean, this is a possibility. The good thing about the AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, is that it's really reserved to African producers so that they can export to the US. Exporting to the EU, you'd be placed in another scheme under a different type of market access. And then you'd be competing with other very efficient producers, such as Bangladesh or Cambodia, right? So the US market is really a unique opportunity for African textile and garment in that sense.
Okay, Linda Calabresi from the Overseas Development Institute, thank you very much indeed for talking to us. I know you guys want to get in that. Tete, your response to that?
I mean, what David said earlier is so apposite to the situation. Because actually the victory of Rwanda is that we're discussing this situation on the show, something which nobody knew about before, which is perhaps an unintended consequence of what you call Trump's constructive disruption.
Yes.
Because the world narrative of trade has very conveniently sidestepped certain kind of the darker corners.
Well, the thing is, because we're encouraged to believe that, there's a kind of a consensus, a neoliberal consensus, that we have world trade that is free.
Which is, it's completely false, because it's been damaging Africa as a continent. As just one example, and Africa isn't the only example. I mean, our guest here just mentioned the situation in Bangladesh and Cambodia, but you need to see the terms and conditions under which Bangladeshi and Cambodian producers are producing their stuff to be efficient for world trade, and it's completely unacceptable.
David, I'm going to finish with you. What do you think is going to happen? You've talked about creative disruption. This could end positively, but in your heart of hearts, as a specialist on this, as an arbiter on this, what do you think?
Well, I'm concerned about developing countries like Rwanda because the World Trade Organization system never really has worked as well for these countries as it was meant to do. 2/3 of the membership of the WTO are developing countries, but they've always really been at the margins because some of the worst policies affecting Africa most negatively have continued. The European Common Agricultural Policy, to name one example, one of Africa's great advantages, comparative advantages, is agriculture, and this has been suppressed through the allowance of subsidies in the EU. And the other real foible here is that in the World Trade Organization system, if Rwanda were to pursue a claim against the U.S., claiming that the U.S. had behaved in a protectionist way, I'm not sure that that would help, because all the WTO would do is say, okay, well, we'll authorize retaliation, but as your guest pointed out, if the retaliation is tariffs, then ultimately that's probably just going to damage the Rwandan economy or damage the Rwandan consumer. So what's the answer? And there is an answer, and the World Trade Organization has shown some flexibility and creativity. There was the case that Antigua brought against the U.S., in which Antigua, a tiny Caribbean island country, was enabled to retaliate against the U.S. through the intellectual property agreement. So hit the U.S. where it hurts is copyright and trademark. So maybe something creative like that would be a way of empowering.
So the answer lies once again in a rules-based system, even though we're living in a period of creative disruption. So people seem to think. Well, that's it for this week's programme. Thanks very much to my studio guests, Tete Kofi and Professor David Collins. For news of next week's topic and to get your views in early, check out Doubling Down TV on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Till then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.